All right, fam, welcome to another episode of She Will Not Fall. We're in season 2. And of course, season 2 is all about liberation. And we're talking about that. And I have another amazing guest, Ajanae, because I want to make sure I say it right. Correct me. Okay, Ajanae is my special guest. And we're going to be talking about liberation. But as you know, we try to get to know our guests in a special way. So Ajanae, I know that the question was hard.
Yes.
But for people to kind of get a sense of what your personality is, if you had to describe yourself as a song title or a book title, what would it be and why?
So I'm going with Higher Love by Whitney Houston and Kygo. And one, because Whitney Houston, I am a Whitney Houston stan. Like for me, she's it for me. Like she
Same.
is peak Black girl. And I think I have so many emotions tied to like the person that is Whitney Houston, or like the public version of that person that we got access to. And so there's like a particular kind of joy that's set in that, but also this idea of just constantly reaching for a like deeper or higher or more divine form of love is, I think, what all of my concepts of navigating my life or reaching towards the life that I want to live are centered around right now.
Yeah.
I've tried a lot of other variations of how to center my life, or things or philosophies that I wanted to center my life around, and nothing has been as productive and edifying as just like aiming to be somebody who is capable of loving people in more whole and healthier ways. So that's what I'm going to go with.
That's beautiful to me. Like, I think trying to, and I honestly, wanting to liberate others is a form of love.
Amen.
And it is love, really. Like,
yeah.
I was looking at the video today, and though I understood what the person was saying, I was like, I don't know if I agree with that. Like, she was saying, through your deconstruction process, you don't want to take things that you learned in, fundamentalism or evangelicalism and apply it to now this. So she was like, you don't have to, and she used the word evangelize your new outlook to people. And she was like, you don't have to, try to recruit folks like you would probably, in evangelical, just walk your own journey. And I was like, I understand what you mean. And no, I'm not trying to necessarily evangelize, like trying to make you into or convert you over into what I'm thinking. But I do think that if I'm walking in a form of liberation or a form of love, I gotta share this with people.
Listen, you have to share it with people. And I think not just that, but I think the politics of it become mucky because we have so many negative connotations, right, with some of this language like proselytizing. And we know that some very manipulative forms of proselytizing have been used. But it's also like, if I see a sister of mine, or, sister, sibling, whatever, somebody in Christ who is not free for like a reason that is like limiting, whether it's like fear-based or whatever, and they're not experiencing liberation, like that is my responsibility. It's my responsibility to, in some way, even if it's not what we traditionally consider proselytizing, even if it's just by like being really bold about like, yo, this is the thing that I've been set free from. I've been set free from this thing, from this form of fear, and I'm not out here struggling the way that I was. Then I think that's almost like an obligation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't think it's the same thing, especially because so many folks are coming out of spaces and they're coming out with trauma. They're coming out with their relationships with God have been inextricably impacted. Their relationships with community have been impacted, and they're like only able to love out of a wound, because that's what happens. Like, and we see it really frequently in the deconstruction space where people enter deconstruction and it's like they can't even enjoy God anymore, because there's just so much anger, and there's space for that, and there's there's absolutely space for that, space for anger, space for rage. But at some point, like, I want people to be able to love God, not from the wound, you know?
Yes. Whew. Listen, we ain't even dove into like the actual questions, and I'm like, hey man, we can end right there. So talking about liberation, I know that there can be communal definitions for liberation and for groups of people, but I always like to ask guests, what does liberation look like to you personally? Like, how do you define it?
Oh, low key, all your questions were hard. I'm not even gonna hold you. I was looking through them. I was like, all right. I don't know if I have just like one specific definition that is overarching. But I think the biggest one is having the freedom and space to come into fuller and better versions of myself. I think that liberation looks like a lot of things right now in the public sphere. And I think that I don't really have all of the rhetoric always. And it's not that I don't know how to use it, but there was a point in my life where I'd like just started to discover liberative politics, the language for them, what they were supposed to mean and what they were doing. And I discovered them while I was in college, and I was using them to decimate people. Like there was like no love in my practice, but I was like, yeah, we're getting free over here. And like, as soon as somebody misspoke, as soon as somebody said the wrong thing, I was jumping down people's throats because I had this arsenal of language around what liberation meant. And I had no praxis, no praxis at all.
Yes.
So for me, a lot of what liberation is centered around is in our ability to apply what we claim our ethics are. So, and then our ability to grow in those gaps. So not just not just do I have like freedom in these myriad of capacities that I should, but do I have the freedom to grow as a person?
Yeah.
Do I have the freedom? Am I so worn out by all the socioeconomic circumstances of life that I literally can't even get to the next level of thinking about what a better version of this world would look like, what better versions of my relationships with people would look like, where I can't even think about what it might look like to be accountable. I know we talk about this really frequently, even just thinking about our parents and like the lives that they were living and how our parents might have disciplined us a little different than like we planned, but a lot of our parents were like in survival mode. Like they didn't have this freedom, they didn't have the liberation to like be accountable to what they were just like, we got to get this food on the table, we got to keep this roof over our head, you know what I'm saying? And so I think a lot of liberation is like, what do I have the capacity for? Because nothing is ever going to be a perfect system. We're humans, we're messy, we're going to continue to harm each other, but do we have the capacity and space to move and grow? And the like knowledge to do that, I guess. My concept of liberation is centered around that, which might not be specific enough.
No, that's perfect. Because two things you said. One, having the space to be yourself, like your whole self. Like, I don't think people really realize how much of a privilege that is, because so many of us have spaces where we cannot be ourselves. We have to be these other versions of ourselves, unfortunately. Like, I hate code switching. Like, I just don't like it. But it goes kind of what you were saying. Some of that has been survival. Like, because if I don't code switch in this space, I'm not gonna be able to. So I tell any person, if you're able to just be your whole complete self and wherever you go, and that is completely a privilege. So I'm happy that you said that, because I don't think people really realize that that's a part of liberation too. It's just being able to be you.
Yes.
Like, being able to be yourself.
Yes.
So for us to learn a little bit more about you, and we're talking about liberation, so I like to tie in those two things together. how are you seeing liberation show up in the work that you do?
Beautiful. So I'm a poet and an educator. I'm a theology editor for a literary magazine called EcoTheo. I'm also now a podcast host for a show called Versus. I think that it maybe shows up differently in different spaces. One of the first things that started pushing me towards a more, I'm just making words up, like tossing things together, like a more liberative ethic, was seeing other women operate in spaces where they were being vulnerable, where they were acknowledging themselves as full people, where they were sharing kind of like the ugly parts. And I'm not talking traditional church testimonies, which, time and place, we value them, but who are really like walking testimonies consistently. And then I felt like they showed me what was possible. And by watching them, I kind of got to be a little free on my own and be like, oh, I can do that, things that I would have never thought were possible. So in my own work, I think I'm almost trying to replicate a version of that. So like the writing I'm doing right now is dealing a lot with my relationship with my mother. It's dealing a lot with the ethics of memory and storytelling and who gets the right to tell what story, right? And for the first time in my life, I am like, many of the poems are implicating myself as somebody who's like caused harm and somebody who is capable of causing harm to people through my actions. And I think that I try to work in confessional modes with the hope that one, somebody feels a little less alone, but two, that the work that I'm doing ends up acting as a mirror to somebody, because that's what the work that other people did for me was. So other people would be transparent, they would be vulnerable, they would share these pieces of their story. And then I would look at them and I would be able to see myself more clearly. And I'm like, there's all kinds of before and after church approved testimonies I could share, but what happens if I just really implicate myself as somebody who is just kind of a mess? And I share that, and then somebody else can see themselves through that and then work towards a form of freedom after having been able to see that. So I think a lot of my work is that, and then also trying to give people language to articulate what they're going through.
Oh, that's so good. I want to ask you this question because you are a poet. How do you see the arts, so being a creative and creatives playing a key part in liberating folks? Because I think a lot of times people think more traditional, so like preaching or even singing, but primarily coming from the pulpit. But I really think that arts play a critical piece and creatives play a critical piece in either writing the soundtrack to liberation, whether that's through music, through poetry, through whatever it is, through actual art, like painting, like all of those things. So I would love to hear your perspective on that, like how important that is, that we need creatives for liberation.
We absolutely need creatives. I think that let me get my language together for this, because I want to try to speak precisely, because I tend to speak a little roundabout. So one of the things that I'm working with right now is this concept of prophetic imagination. And I think that creatives, particularly Black creatives, tend to exercise prophetic imagination in their work. And essentially in them creating, which I think of creating as a space where I'm collaborating with God. I think of creating as a space where it's not me. It is like, it's like I'm sitting down and me and God are like, all right, what are we about to do? Makoto Fujimura, who is a brilliant painter and theologian, has a book called Art and Faith, and he talks a lot about this theory or this theology of making. And I think there is something to that. And I think there is something to the work that we make being prophetic, being things that can either build worlds for us, that can reflect the world that we're in back to us, or that can like be a catalyst for change. So I'm thinking about folks who are not even traditionally or like might not even consider themselves Christian, but are creating that work, and the work is just, it's just prophetic. like Octavia Butler was just prophetic.
Yes.
There's not really a way around that. And then I'm thinking about a lot of activist work in general relies on a kind of prophetic imagination. If we think about folks like Martin Luther King Jr., that man is a prophet. Like
Yes.
there's just no other way around it. And the capacity to say, okay, I'm looking at the world around me, but what I'm seeing is something else. I'm seeing in the supernatural. I'm seeing in a completely different realm. And that's what I'm getting ready to translate for people so that they can see the vision that I'm seeing. They can see the vision that God has given me. I think in that way, creatives are pushing us towards liberation because they're constantly expanding our imagination of what's possible. And they're like giving us a glimpse into these things that are being created with God. And Makoto Fujimura, his idea is that like the things that we're creating in this earth are things that God will use in the new earth. It's a really beautiful, brilliant concept. So like if we're out here building spaces where like there are no prisoners, where there are no people who are going hungry, there are no children who are being abused, then what that becomes in this kind of afterlife and how God shapes and molds that. Like what does music sound like in heaven? What do poems, what does all of these things, what do they sound like? What are these things that we're building, whether through our language or these other forms sound like? And I think creatives are kind of leading the charge on, at the very least, what it looks like to imagine. I think we need lots of other folks to help with the execution of these things, because creatives be having lots of imagination and no executive functioning skills.
So true.
But I think that's such a piece of it. And I know there's so many things in this world that I don't know that I could have imagined until somebody else like wrote the thing or set the thing and created the thing. And all of a sudden I was able to imagine myself as a different woman, as a woman with larger capacity. I was able to imagine the world in a different way. I was able to see God differently, and it impacted my relationship with God. I think even just like about Danez Smith, I don't want to mess up the poem they wrote, because I reference their work for a few things with this, but they have a poem where, is it somewhere? Where essentially they're imagining an afterlife for Black people. And like visually, it's insane. Like they're coming up from these graves, like they're coming up from these graves. They're being brought into the earth in this way, and things that were used as weapons in the natural world become almost like tools of liberation in this heaven. I'm probably explaining this really poorly, and I don't have the book next to me. I'm gonna have to like link it or something, so people don't take my poor description as indicative of Danez's creative work, because Danez is absolutely brilliant. But like that's the kind of stuff I'm thinking about, and so then I'm like, oh wow, how might heaven be restorative for Black people? You know what I mean? And that helps me fall deeper in love with the gospel.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm gonna stop rambling.
No, when I say that, that's so perfect, because I think a lot of times I don't think people really see the value that creatives have when it comes to expressing the divine, not just for what our present context is, but the hope that is to come. You know what I'm saying? And so when I think about music and the arts and dance and singing, and all of those things are so critical, even to movements, right? You have artists who have written soundtracks to movements and to bring awareness that something is going on. Like I was reading about strange fruit, and when it came out, like the FBI and CIA were literally trying to like ruin her life while she's singing about a reality that is happening. Like,
I listen, and I'm like, but that is like the power of it. Like Toni Morrison talking about how, I don't remember what book it was that they were trying to ban in the prisons, and she like framed the letter they sent her talking about it. Was like, wow, how powerful that this little book is going to cause riots. Wow.
Right. Like it's amazing. But I think that speaks to the power that we have to give, like you said, give language to folks, but also that people can see themselves.
Yes.
Like, and that's to me is a key part of liberation, is can you help people see themselves? Can you help people see a better way, you know?
And specifically, I'm always like, and can I help people see God better? Because I realize so frequently the image of God that has been constructed is like, it's rough. It's rough when people be telling me like who they think God is. I'm like, oh, that's rough. And so what does it mean for somebody to be able to get to know a different version of God than the one that they were taught, and this one that they were taught that is like harming them, or that has been actively harming them through people and through perspectives of people.
I'm glad we're talking about this. This is like literally, this is why I always love this podcast, because we are organic around here. We go with where the conversation goes. But I'm glad you brought that up, because that's been something that I've been thinking about. Like I have really been thinking about music, because that's my area, and worship. And the other day I was really listening to like a lot of gospel CCM music, and just kind of listen. And I was like, we speak about ourselves so negatively. Like the way we talk about our bodies when it comes into relation with God it makes me sad. And so but it also makes sense why people feel the way that they do, or feel like God hates them, or God does not love. But so I've really been on this tangent of really looking at how the body is holy and divine, because most times it's, you are filthy rags. You are like, we got all of these like sayings and terms and all these things. And I'm like, no, first of all, it frustrates me, number one. But number two, I'm like, why do we thinking badly of ourselves makes us closer to God and to the divine? And that's the tension that I sit with, right? So I really think that I really want to help liberate folks on that.
Listen, we can have a whole conversation about this whole situation, because I think when I was at the worst place in my faith, I had like a whole faith identity crisis, like maybe 2 years ago. In the pandemic, listen, we was going through it in the pandemic, okay?
Listen.
And that I was like, I think that was one of the things that was tearing me up, was just this, I couldn't get past this idea that I just like, nothing was good enough. Nothing was ever gonna be good enough. I was like repenting every 2 seconds, like, Lord, sorry, because I breathed wrong. I took 3 deep breaths instead of 2. Was I being obedient to, like, it was just it was out of control. And who said this? All right, this is half my problem. Okay, I'm not one of those, like, I really admire writers who like they got all the quotes memorized in their head, and they're like on page 32 in the 3rd paragraph they said. I'm not that person. I remember ideas, and I don't remember if it was Candace Bimbo who said this, and I might have got that wrong, but someone was talking about the way that we view people through their sin. And how that distorts the image of them. And I think when you're talking about that, I think part of it is the way we're frequently taught the gospel. It doesn't just distort the image of God, but then it distorts the image of ourselves. So then when we look at ourselves, we can't see ourselves in our fullness. We can see ourselves in and by our sin. And our sin is definitely prevalent. I'm definitely messy. I definitely like need to be gotten together frequently, right? But the image of myself is distorted. And it blew my mind again. If it was Candace, don't remember, but essentially someone had said, they were like, imagine if we viewed Eve not through the lens of her having eaten this apple. And it just dawned on me that I've only ever viewed Eve as like the reason for the fall, but she was like this whole person, this whole human, this whole daughter of God, and you know what I'm saying? It's kicking it with God, has been reconciled to God, but I view her through this singular sin. And how has that distorted my image of the mother of creation? You know what I mean?
Yes.
And then, and in turn, how am I distorting the image of myself when I look at myself and I can only see my sin, I can only see my faults, my dirty rags, et cetera, and I cannot see my whole person. And then how does that distort the image of God as well?
Absolutely.
And the folks around me, how am I less gracious, which I have been?
That part.
Used to be way less gracious about other people's sins than, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Used to be wild when other people would mess up. And how do those distortions then like impact our capacity for love? Because it's a whole lot harder to love myself if I can only see myself through the apple I ate, right?
Exactly.
I'm over here using Eve's name as a curse every time I get a cramp. Like, oh, doggone it, you Eve. Like,
but like you say, and it's hard to love other people. It's like if you can't love yourself, right? So the greatest commandment, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. A lot of people can't love their neighbor because they don't love themselves.
Yes. Got the wrong image of God in the first place. Loving the wrong God. Can't see ourselves clearly. Don't love ourselves. Don't love our neighbor. It's a mess.
It's a whole complete mess. Listen, I'm telling you. Oh my gosh. So thank you for doing that, because I think a lot of people that I've had on the podcast, I've had some creatives, but I love creatives because I am one. So anytime that I can talk to creatives and, you know, us expound a little bit more about the importance of the work that we do, I'm always going to do that because that's just my favorite thing. Thinking about what you do and thinking about future, what are some ways that you're hoping to liberate others? And and women, Black folks, whatever, whoever, what are in your work? What are some ways that you're hoping that you can continue to liberate folks?
I'm invested in making space for people who have felt harmed by the church, who have felt like God, Christianity wasn't for them because of who they are. I think a lot about the legacy of DMX, and how when he passed, all these folks who like I definitely don't think would identify as Christian, but like flooded my timeline with their stories about how DMX was one of the people who made them feel like there was a space for them in this faith world. Like that is what I'm invested in. That I don't care if you've been away from the church for 30 years, if you ain't picked up a Bible, if you ain't prayed, if you was cussing God out yesterday, you know what I mean?
Right.
That there is something in some of the work I do that doesn't narrow the path, that doesn't close in the path to relationship with God, but instead it might make somebody say, oh dang, maybe there is space in this thing for me, as opposed to what has been the opposite for a lot of folks, which is there is not space for me here and I am not safe here.
Yeah. And that's super critical. One of the things that I tell my friends, I think I've said it on several episodes, but is we have to be okay with creating spaces outside of a traditional structure, because there's some folks that will never go back to church.
Yep.
But I think that we can create communities where people feel accepted, they feel safe, and that they can heal. Because that's the thing. Like a lot of times we will we'll be in environments, but we kind of like are in defensive mode because we're trying to protect ourselves. But to have a space where you can wholly heal is monumental. So I think that is critical. So I'm grateful for folks like you and others who are trying to create those spaces, because it's real out here in these streets. And like, it is real out here in these streets. And I see so many people who are like, yeah, I'm never going back to church, but they still desire to have a connection with God, and they need a space that's not attached to that, so they can be, in some cases, introduced to God. Because what you said earlier, the God that they thought that wasn't it. That like,
listen, my concept of God when I was growing up was like, Jesus is the person you go to see when you're done having fun, so that way you could be like boring and shackled for the rest of your life. That's really what I thought about. And like, it was shout out to Erica Dickerson, was just like a brilliant playwright, brilliant worker. And she used to teach a Bible study that I started attending at UW-Madison. And it was my first time, and I realized it was my first time being taught the Bible by a Black woman. It was my first time. I'd been in church for a long time, and you know how it goes in apostolic churches, Black women were the prayer warriors, were the prophetesses, we're the church mothers, we run kids ministry, but we're not the folks who are equipped in seminary. And not even to say that seminary is the only way to be able to teach the Bible, but we're not the folks who go to Bible school. We're not the folks who are sit down and doing the breakdown of scripture. And I realized it was my first time ever being taught the Bible by a Black woman. And I was like, I ain't never heard of this Jesus. And I was like, oh, that's all y'all had to say. I was like, oh, I'm game. It's me and Jesus then. Like, what? I was like, Jesus gang, like, where do I sign up?
Yes.
So yes,
I love that.
Introduction is awesome. I would like to reintroduce myself. That's really
yes. And that's what I'm saying. Like, I think having these spaces is critical because it gives you a reintroduction, honestly, some of us don't need a reintroduction to the God that the version of God that we got. We need an introduction and a fresh perspective. So I think it is so critical when we are dedicated to that type of work, and we got to do that. So we've covered a lot of things. So I want to give you the floor. What are your final thoughts? Anything you want to leave, and then also let people know how they can follow you, support the work that you're doing.
Final thoughts. I don't know. I feel like maybe it's just a charge. My charge to everybody is to not in the ways that we've been taught to like just absolutely like abhor and hate ourselves, but to really investigate like, how are my politics, my claims, how are they lining up with my actions? When I say that I love Black women, do I love Black women? And then am I being mean and cruel to the Black women who are like under me? Am I, I think about even in my own life, just some like missteps I've made with sisters in ways that I've harmed women in my life, like just not executing the practice. I'm talking about them on social media, talking about protect Black girls, protect whatever, but in my interpersonal relationships, like I'm messy. So my charge is to ask folks to investigate, like, what are your ethics, like genuinely, what are your ethics informed by faith, and then how are they showing up in your praxis, and how are they a reflection of God, and how can you continue to expand that view of God, and then also show yourself grace in the process, and hope that in showing yourself that grace and then continuing to show up as that better version of yourself, that stuff is like really contagious. Like, it just is. Like, I've given some apologies in my life that like I literally could see like chains like breaking off of folks just by the act of me going and saying, you know what, I was dead wrong. I was dead wrong for this, and I'm sorry. And I don't know, there's just like freedom on the other side of our accountability for other people, like us being accountable for ourselves, us being accountable for our own actions, and being accountable for the way we love people. Like there is like, we talk about like what we can do to liberate people. There's like grassroots movements and all this stuff, but there's like freedom for other people and us just being accountable for the things that we do. And I think even if we just think about the apologies that we're waiting on from people, that we just are like constantly reconciling that this person's never going to do right by me, like there's people we can do right by, and trying to make amends with. So I don't know, that's always my thing, reconcile with somebody. If you can, liberation, I think liberation is in the reconciling.
Yes. How can people follow you? What are you working on that people can support?
Yes, people can follow me on social media, Moons at Dusk, which I've been for like 10 years at this part. I'm like, I want to change that handle, but it's kind of part of my identity now. Moons at Dusk on Twitter and Instagram. I'm working on a lot of things. Like I said, I'm the theology editor for EcoTheo. If you are a writer, and you would like to submit an essay dealing with culture and theology and ecology and theology, you can send it my way. I would love to see it. I am a co-host for the Versus podcast through the Poetry Foundation. You can check that out when the episodes come out. And I'm going to be in Cincinnati for residency soon. I'll be doing like 2 weeks worth of programming. I post a lot about the stuff that I'm doing, but you can just check out the things that I post on socials, the writings and performances, etc., and share them. That would be great.
I love it. So Ajanae, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to sit down and have a conversation about liberation. It has been an amazing conversation. And I know that I got a lot out of it. So I know that those who are listening will get a lot out of it. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. This was so nice.
Of course.